Hello and welcome to the Global Perspective Show. I'm John Bersia, Special Assistant to the President for Global Perspectives at the University of Central Florida. Our guest today is Dr. Anupam Srivastava, who is a professor, researcher at the University of Georgia and one of the leaders of the India-China-America Institute. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. Tell us a little bit about your research and teaching at the University of Georgia, and then a little bit about the Institute, because I'm sure that's something most of our viewers today haven't heard much about.
Mm-hmm. Well, at the University of Georgia, the teaching is in the School of Public and International Affairs, and they focus on foreign policy, national security issues, U.S. engagement with major Asian powers like China, Russia, Japan, and India, that kind of work. The Center for International Trade and Security, where I direct the Asia program and the research of that center, that focuses on non-proliferation and export control type of issues, which, as you know, what we do is we started 22 years ago in 1987, and over the course of this time frame, we developed capacity in measuring the elements and systems that governments put in place to regulate trade in advanced technology that has both commercial applications but are also usable in making nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, bioweapons, missiles, aerospace, and so on. And so over the course of these 20 years, we have now worked in about 75 countries. And about 10 years ago, we started working heavily with the major corporations around the world to help them secure their own technologies as they trade. And about 5-6 years ago, when the UN Security Council passed a resolution 1540, which required all countries in the world to create a legal architecture to not assist any transfers of these items to terrorists or non-state actors, we started working very closely with them and now are partnering with them to provide training and outreach to countries around the world. We also work closely with the International Atomic Energy Agency, which does this work, and some other multiple groupings, regional groupings that I'm a part of.
How does the work at the university relate to the work at the Institute, which is a separate non-profit entity based on my understanding?
There are two different bodies that I'm associated with. One is the Center for International Trade and Security, whose work I was describing, and that is a unit of the school and of the university. The institute is the India-China-America Institute, that Professor Jagdish and I had some role in creating. And that is looking at different silos or different divisions of work, looking at how does the United States understand and cooperate and take advantage of business opportunities that are growing in India and China. And it's got a diverse set of divisions that it focuses on. Energy is a big part of it, security is a big part of it, and so is trade. And so we work with governments but also practitioners on the ground to help create collaborative linkages. Some of them result in research outputs. Some of them are more hands-on in terms of working with corporations on the ground, targeted strategic consultancy with these companies to help do matchmaking for them so they find their relevant counterparts there. And that is how that work happens. That's a separate independent body.
When was that established? That's fairly...
This was about, yes, 4 years ago that this was created. And it does a lot of executive education, other kinds of programs, but it's a fairly new establishment. Its strength derives from the established reputation of collaborators on it, which are very highly placed people in the corporate or the government field in all the three countries. And the name actually came up with, given by Jairam Ramesh, who's now the Indian Minister for Climate, Environment. He's a very old friend of mine, and he said that I tried all the combinations and realized that CIA does not work, China, India.
Yeah, no.
And so he came up with the idea, and we stuck to it. He and others had then popularized the use of the word Chindia, China, India, and because these countries and their economies are both in some ways complementary but also contrasting, understanding the cultural and other granulated realities of these countries helps American business take advantage of these massive opportunities that are growing there. And so that was the driving force and still is the focus of this institute's work.
Well, talk a little bit about how the world's eye has shifted increasingly to China initially, and then to China and India in recent decades. We've watched the reforms and the spectacular changes that have occurred, but I don't know if, again, the average viewer is aware of what this means for the not too distant future.
Well, let's take one at a time. China had what it calls missed decades of development through the 50s and the 60s, through Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward types of things. And then the open door policy, the Haping Jueqi, the Gai Kaifang policy of opening the doors in 1979. Till 1983, the Chinese economy is actually smaller than India's, and exports were a very small portion of their GDP because they were very inward looking. But then China has steadily grown at impressive levels of growth, and the last 2 decades they've averaged about 10%, which is almost unparalleled, except for maybe Japan for a brief period in their early post-World War II history. What that has done is China has now surpassed the US and Germany to be the largest exporter and importer in the world. And having captured the world market in low cost, low technology, high volume commodities, they have steadily invested in moving up the value chain in products and some in services. India has a somewhat different but similar kind of a story, where the private sector was always free to operate in India, but you had government protection and tariff walls and so on. By 91, when these things came to a head, the government decided to undertake systematic reforms and lower these walls. The private sector zoomed, the government's own public sector began to have more synergy with the private sector. So you have spin-on, spin-off benefits that came out of it. And India's also opened up to the export sector. China, of course, has 2/3 of its economy dependent on exports. So they're reaching some of the limits of that model of growth, and they're emphasizing domestic consumption. In India, it's always been a more balanced portfolio, but the government is now emphasizing more exports. One other fact to notice is that over half of global investable capital, money that people have to invest, is now invested in Asia, and about 2/3 of that is invested in India and China. So what you have is a situation where a person in Netherlands is looking to invest his 100 euros and realizes that European Union and the US sectors are, say, growing at 3%, so his returns on that investment is a little low. He puts it in China or India, makes a lot of money. He used to bring it back to American or EU banks, but now he's realizing that the banks in China and India are paying him higher returns, so he keeps the money there and then puts it back into another project. So some of that money is staying there, and what that means is that capital is becoming more easily available in these two countries, and that means that technology, which is very expensive to buy, is becoming easier for these countries to buy because of the relatively wider availability of capital for them. And so that's spurring further their technology intensive growth toward higher value chain. And that's why it's opening up both competition for the US, but also major opportunities for our government, but particularly the private sector, to engage these countries and conduct R&D, produce commodities that will be sold into these vast markets, but also globally. And that's why these two countries are emerging increasingly on the US radar as a destination for business, and also some bad press or controversial issues like outsourcing, state of intellectual property rights, human rights, environment, climate change types of issues.
Now, you and your work are as interested in security issues as you are in economic and trade issues, which is a wonderful combination, because I don't think you can separate the two in most settings. With the rise of both China and India, we haven't been concerned to this point about their military capabilities and interests, somewhat so with China, but certainly not with India. But as China continues to devote more and more resources to military spending, what could this mean for the future? Do you think one or both have any designs on becoming true superpowers with global reach and influence?
And that's a very, very important subject. China has not only been growing at about 10%, but its military modernization is now almost 20 years old, and they've been spending between 15 to 25, sometimes 30%. The military budget has been increasing by about 15 to 25%. Some of that has meant that they're simply modernizing from a infantry and tank heavy kind of an approach toward more joint operations, being able to do sea lift or airlift and take their troops to certain places, also disaster response or evacuation types of things. They've also studied very carefully when the US invasion of Iraq happened, both of those, and are trying to prepare themselves for a situation where the US defense of Taiwan might reach a situation where China is fundamentally raising the US costs of intervening on behalf of Taiwan. This is called asymmetric warfare. We are not fighting you strength from strength, but we will do area deniability. We will raise your costs to the point where if we can inflict a level of pain that's beyond your threshold of tolerance, then you will not intervene. But the reality also is that Taiwan has invested upwards of $85–90 billion into mainland China, and China has invested about $50 billion. So you will see them peacefully coexisting, and these demands for separation will actually over time die down. So there will be a sort of situation where the military type of an option will never really come to be exercised. On the broader scale, what Beijing is doing is it's re-establishing its historical perimeters of prominence in the Asia-Pacific area. It's been a great civilization throughout most of its history, except the last 300 years. And it's expanding its soft influence in Central Asia, in South Asia, and certainly in Southeast Asia and East Asia. And some of that and settlement of land or sea boundaries of China have been either with the use of force or threat of use of force. And that has created some anxiety and concern amongst the regional players. So Washington is working with some of them, including Japan, South Korea, and others, to shore up capabilities in those countries for active defense and types of things. Beyond that, I don't think they are going to have a military confrontation with China. The fault line or problem is, as China expands its influence and the United States wants to remain the most important extra-regional player in Asia, how are they going to balance each other's roles and responsibilities in that region? India's military capabilities are not, India does not spend as much on the military. China spends unofficially about $90 billion, and we in the US spend about $400 to $500 billion. But as I said, China is focusing on certain areas, not across the board. India's military budget is only about $40 billion. But again, it's defending all its perimeters, including on the west with Pakistan, long coastline, and certainly the border with China. It has developed capabilities, but that has grown as an issue of comfort for Washington because it sees India as a potential strategic partner and a military cooperation in a number of areas, including search and rescue and all of these things in the Indian Ocean. So that does not raise any fundamental long-term military concerns in Washington. Rather, it's an ally. And as I said with China, it's not likely that they will create a policy situation where military conflict is the only outcome. They will both want to avoid that because they're also very heavily engaged in other areas and they want to work together.
So over the next 20 to 30 years, do you see one or the other aspiring to superpower status in a way of really projecting influence? Amy Chua has written on this topic and has been here, and she seemed to think that neither one had that aspiration, but others obviously have different opinions.
Right. Well, China has a doctrine that they articulated called the Peaceful Rise, Haping-Jueqi, which argues that China's rise to global prominence is going to be different from that of previous world powers, including all the way from Turkey to UK to Germany to the United States. But that logic does not convince everybody else, and behavior of China in the last 10 years is increasingly that it's bringing all instruments of state power to bear in securing favorable outcomes for itself. And this assertive behavior is beginning to trouble China's neighbors, including India, and definitely Washington. And when it comes to revaluation of their currency or unfair trade practices, human rights, environment sorts of issues, you see a much more assertive Beijing pushback on these issues, saying we will do what we deem fit for China's national interest. So while China is becoming a stakeholder in the global economic and security institutions, there is a latent tendency to A, become a decisive player in the Asia Pacific, B, in some ways determine or filter the scale and scope of US involvement and engagement in the Asia Pacific. And C is that China does not want to establish its frontiers beyond a certain point. So what it is doing is it's building up relationships to source materials from Africa and Latin America, and it will build a navy to secure those things. It is working with Pakistan very heavily to keep India tied down as a South Asian power rather than challenge it on the Asian stage. It will do those things, but it will do it subtly to a point where it will never assert itself as a global power, at least not in the next 10 years. But after that, it might do that. There was a incidents in Davos and in Copenhagen very recently where a Chinese official wagged a finger at President Obama, and that was a very considerable deliberate Chinese move to send a signal. There are these latent signs of some of that assertiveness in China, but it also skillfully plays to multiple images of China. When it comes to developmental and economic issues, it will play itself as a developing power because it's not quite in the league of developed countries when you look at per capita growth figures and so on. So an increasingly assertive Beijing, certainly in the Asia Pacific, is what you will see, also in the global financial and economic institutions. Certainly when it comes to sanctions on Iran types of issues as a member of the Security Council in the United Nations, but will not call itself a global power and certainly not one that is there to challenge the United States, at least not for the next 10 years, 15 years. But behavior-wise, it will keep creating more favorable outcomes for itself. India, briefly speaking, has neither the capacity to do so, nor even the interest to project itself as a global power. It wants to be a knowledge-intensive center of growth, tackle its indigenous problems of unemployment, its security perimeter there are lots of challenges that India has to solve. Beyond that, it wants to be known for thought leadership in the world, saying disarmament, abolition of nuclear weapons, more peaceful resolution of conflicts, types of things. You have pragmatism that's come into the Indian foreign policy and slightly more muscular approach in dealing with smaller neighbors and other kinds of things, but nothing of the kind that you associate with a hegemon or a global power. It's, as I said, not India's interest and doesn't even sit well with the fundamental Indian values of where it sees itself as a country.
We have established programs here at UCF in both India studies and Taiwan studies in recent years, and are looking for opportunities to grow those in various directions. Speaking about India specifically, what are the types of things that you think would represent added value to an India program? And you know a little bit about the program here from our discussions.
Indeed, my interaction with faculty and students and some material that you've shared with me gives me some idea. I think the first thing I would say is that you should capture in brief documents some of the comparative advantage that you have in certain departments and units on the campus. I've seen some discussion about molecular biology to life sciences, certainly in the arts area and some others. India has several suitors, so to speak, that go to it from different states in this country to governors and others leading missions or university presidents. And the governors or chief ministers in India sometimes to me have asked this question, saying, well, we are always interested in hosting these people and building up educational opportunities. What we want to hear from them, however, is what is their comparative advantage, because we want to build partnership with them in those areas where they are most best suited. So that would be one recommendation, that you create that body of documentation of what the university presents, which is, and then you can match it with India's growth areas that we've talked about. The two leaders of the two countries have identified education as a major sector of growth. There is substantial government funding to facilitate exchange of students and faculty and R&D programs. There is a big push on biotechnology and pharmaceutical sector, energy cooperation. Civilian space is another area where the two countries are working very well together now. And I know that UCF has significant capabilities in these areas, so they would become the natural areas where I would recommend that you take this story and then link them with the relevant counterpart institutions in India. The other thing I'll mention is that in India they have a bill that has been cleared by the cabinet, so all the bureaucracies have signed off on it, and they have to get that act debated and passed in the parliament. This will allow India to do two things. They are building 40 major universities in India. 14 of them are going to be centers of innovation and technology excellence of the same caliber as the Indian Institutes of Technology and Management. So they become potentially pairing opportunities for UCF. And the final piece of that legislation is a foreign educators bill, which will allow foreign universities to not only operate on a level playing field in India, but also to be able to award degrees and charge tuition with their own rates and costs kept in mind. There will be, of course, some guidelines that the government will provide, because they don't want that education to be not affordable to the vast majority of people. But they also recognize that higher education is expensive, so there will be that latitude in charging of fees. So that creates a very favorable business environment, but also a large educational pairing collaboration environment in India, and a facilitating role by the governments both in New Delhi and in Washington, and resources. And so I would recommend that you identify your areas of strength and capture those documents. The Indian government and the embassy in Washington are going to be very receptive to facilitating and matchmaking, and there are others well placed in the field that will be also able to provide that kind of assistance, because this is just a natural area of growth. I'll conclude that section of my longer set of remarks by saying that in India there is a very deep appreciation of the significant US help in the first generation of agricultural revolution. And the two countries are now talking about the second generation of revolution. So even the areas of agriculture are very conducive for bilateral cooperation, and there is significant areas of opportunity in research, ripening, staggering the ripening of potatoes, fresh fruits, tomatoes, those kinds of things, refrigeration technologies. There are a whole host of these areas where 30% of India's fresh produce is lost because of lack of refrigeration. So these become then significant opportunities for a university like UCF to provide assistance.
Now, many of our students are interested in different study abroad and other international experiences. What would be the relative advantage of going to India or China for these students rather than somewhere else?
Well, there are major universities in the United States where I am a visiting faculty, and I observe firsthand their programs. The bigger, what is happening is, when you look at corporations around the world, and for business reasons they are going to these countries like China and India, understanding the culture of those countries, understanding the legal regulations and how to operate within that country, knowing the local languages. In India, of course, it's a lot easier if you know English, then you can do business, but certainly in China to learn Mandarin. Without these things, the cost of having made a mistake when you are working already in a professional capacity in a company and so forth, those costs go up, and it even affects your hiring decisions by your employers. Because these are going to be major markets both as producers and consumers of US products, that students, if they learn early on in their educational career by a study abroad program which allows them to be assimilated into that culture, stay immersed for a few weeks to a few months, learn how to operate in that culture, provides a tremendous educational and business advantage to them when they apply in the job market and subsequently are posted or otherwise dealing with these countries, even if their work keeps them in the United States. We need to do this because the Asian markets are very culturally specific. The same requirement held true and still holds true for Japan or working with South Korea and others, and you should do those things. West Europe is easier to work with because the culture is somewhat similar to our own here. East Europe, you do require these kinds of things, but they are not, in terms of business opportunity, not on the same scale as you have China and India, and that is why I would recommend that.
Good.
That
I think we'll conclude on that note. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Delighted to be here.
And thank you. For the Global Perspective Show, I'm John Bersia, and we'll see you next time.